live. This is the Women in Journalism web chat. Thanks for joining us on this kind of rainy Wednesday lunchtime. I know people have got garden parties to get off to, so appreciate you all joining us. I'm so pleased and grateful to have such a stellar lineup actually today. We've got Roy Anikar, who's the royal editor at the Sunday Times. We've got Ailsa Anderson, who is a former press secretary to the Queen. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Russell Myers, who is the royal editor at the Daily Mirror. And you might even recognise him from ITV, where he is often popping up on Lorraine to give his views on the royal family. And so welcome. It's really nice to have you. I think, especially with this week that we've got, we're looking forward to the Jubilee. And there's so much interest in the Queen, will she, won't she? But what I wanted to discuss today was the kind of journalism around it. Some people think that being a royal reporter is all about kind of tiaras and tantrums and, you know, turning up to watch a member of the royal family cut a red ribbon. But having done the beat myself and currently back doing it, I think it's really fascinating to look at it because it's quite a specific kind of beat. Roy, I'm just going to come over to you. You've been covering the royal family for so long now, and you have, I mean that in such a lovely way. I mean, really experienced, and you've seen how it works sort of through the years. What has been your distinction between how the press cover the royal family now and how it was previously? Perhaps there hasn't been a change, but do you think there's been a shift at all in the way that we present the royal family in newspapers?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I have to say I think that how we present the royals in papers and actually how the households give us information about members of the royal family, I find it sort of shifts quite often in terms of who's doing the job. There's certainly, in my experience, I've been lucky actually. When I worked at Telegraph before and now on the Sunday Times, I have been lucky in that I think I've had my experience. I've had editors who have not taken a firm view on members of the royal family and have allowed me to say what I want to say with an enormous amount of freedom and not stick to a party line. And I definitely sort of, you know, if we were all to sit together, or the royal correspondents now, you know, we would all know what our editors, I think, sort of broadly think about the royal family, because you do see that reflected in a lot of the coverage. In terms of sort of how it's changed, I think when I started out, in 2010, so I mean, I really have been doing it a long time now. I mean, at the time, Ailsa was in situ at Buckingham Palace, luckily for me. We're talking about sort of three main households: Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Kensington Palace. I found people, you know, the press secretaries quite open then, and incredibly helpful and able to sort of brief and guide. That sort of changes, and sometimes you get press secretaries that are very happy to be helpful and guide, and other times you get press secretaries who are a little bit withhold a bit more information. But everything ultimately comes down to personal relationships. It really does. Your relationships with the households, you know, the newspaper's relationship with the households, which sometimes depends on, you know, not depends on coverage, but you can feel the sort of, you know, a frost and a chill sometimes if the coverage has been less than flattering, which is it is our job not to flatter. It is our job to write stories that sometimes the households don't want out there. So I would say all of that means that, you know, I think coverage and how we represent them ebbs and flows, and also depending on what's going on. We have had a few years now of quite a lot of drama in the royal family. When I started,
haven't we ever? My goodness, yeah.
Yes, when I started, I remember my predecessor saying, "Oh, you should go for the royals because nothing ever really happens." And then suddenly 2 weeks later, William and Kate got engaged, and it hasn't quietened down since. So yeah, it has changed since I started.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I kind of joined the beat properly in 2011 when we had the royal wedding to look forward to, which was it was all very exciting, but it felt like, you know, the first big story in quite a while. And then obviously there were royal babies that followed, but it's been non-stop ever since. I mean, it's been a tremendously busy beat, and just when you think something's about to die down, something will pop up. It's interesting what you mentioned about that kind of ebbing and flowing of the relationship with the press secretary of the palace, and some being helpful and some not being so helpful. What do you think the coverage is like when they're not so helpful? Because it's interesting to me whether actually that serves them well or not so well. I mean, how useful is it for you to be able to have a kind of grown-up briefing about a story that you're writing?
It's very useful, but the point I suppose the main point I would drive home here is hardly any of my stories come from press secretaries from the households or come from the households. That is not how I find my stories, and I'm sure a lot of us would agree with that. My stories come from contacts, come from sources, come from people I've built up relationships with over many, many years. I tend to take those to the households. If they want to comment, if they want to go, if they want to brief, great, that's helpful. If they want to steer you away from something, go, do you know what, Roy, that's completely wrong, fine. And, we take that on board. So yes, it's helpful to have a grown-up conversation about a positive story and negative story, but it's not the end of the world unless you're putting something that's completely wrong and they don't steer you away from that. And to be honest, they always do for me. But at the end of the day, it's helpful to have a good relationship with the households, but I don't get my stories from the households. And I think that's a sort of misconception with, the public think that press secretaries just hand out stories to the royal correspondents. It's not how it works.
That would be nice, wouldn't it? I think we'd all die of starvation or be out of a job if if that were to be the case. Well, now as someone who must be kind of shifting, thinking, hang on a minute, we've given you some great stories over the years, is Elsa Anderson, who was press secretary to the Queen, and fabulously well thought of in kind of PR terms. But interestingly, Elsa, you started off as a journalist, which not all PRs do. And was that particularly helpful, do you think, when you went into that line of work?
So I think because I came from a journalism background, I understand about deadlines, I understand about, the one fact story, whether it's going to be big or whether it's going to be a splash. I think probably that shaped my view about how to help and maybe get a line into a story. So what Roy was saying about relationships, I'm fortunate enough, in all the jobs I've had, whether it's been in government, whether it's the royal household, whether it's working for the Archbishop of Canterbury, that I've brought my old contacts with me, if you like. I'm sitting here today talking to you. So I do think it's about relationships. And it was interesting, again, with Roy saying, sometimes you won't go to a press secretary because they won't guide and help. Well, if you don't have a relationship where you can guide and help, then you're not going to be able to influence that story at all.
I suppose it's trust, isn't it, on both sides, that you've got to know, the journalist got to know that when you're being told something from inside the palace, from the press secretary, you have to trust that that's the truth. And I suppose that's where the kind of relationships come in. That
Totally. I mean, hand on heart, I've never lied to a journalist in my career. But if I can't tell you something, then I'm very happy to say, I'm so sorry, I can't guide you or comment on that. And a lot of those stories, predominantly, I would say, was about health and medical issues, and personal issues, something that's actually private to that particular member of the royal family. You just can't comment about.
Well, that's interesting. I think there's been a shift in kind of public interest, journalism, and there's so much about health that, we wouldn't even think to print nowadays. Do you think that's changed? Because back when you started in 2001, it was a different landscape, wasn't it?
Yeah, totally. The whole household was very, very different then. So, of course, the News of the World existed. So you'd have that Friday afternoon call with a scoop from Clive Goodman, and you think, crikey, who's he managed to pay off to get that story? Obviously, the climate has completely changed now. But there was, I think, journalists then, there was no deference at all, I don't think, apart from to the Queen herself. And people weren't afraid to ask stories or print stories, whatever we said. And as I said, health issues particularly, the obsession with Prince Philip, he had a bruise under his eye or a scratch on his finger or plaster. And you could get 40, 50 calls on a Saturday about this, which, in the scale of 1 to 10, I don't think it's a big deal.
I remember those pictures, actually. Yeah, so he appeared with a kind of bruising to his eyes, and oh my goodness. I mean, it's interesting. You must be just you never switch off in a job like that. I expect that the phone could go at any minute. come what may, you might be in the middle of a family celebration and that's it.
Oh.
You're back on duty, you know.
Totally. I remember one Christmas, a couple of days before Christmas, I was standing in my kitchen, not wrapped any presents at all, trying to make a spaghetti bolognese. You know, my husband wanted to talk to me about his job, and the phone went, and Prince Philip had been airlifted to Papworth Hospital, which culminated in having a stent put into his heart valve. And
which all later came out, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're dealing with the hospital, you're dealing with the Queen, who was not only the monarch, but a concerned wife. You're dealing with protection officers. There's a whole plethora of people to help you and guide you, eventually, when you're issuing the statement, to approve it. So you've got to tread really, really carefully. But of course, that completely screwed up Christmas.
Oh gosh, I remember that well. Actually, I remember getting my my next door neighbour at the time to go into my get the keys to my house and go into my house to find my kind of file of facts that's in my bedside cabinet, which tells you how long ago that was. It was
well, I took my son to Papworth with my husband the following day. We didn't have any childcare, and Henry thought he was going to see Santa. I said, no, it's not quite Santa, but close.
Oh, the sacrifices you make for serving the royal family. Well, we thank you. And Russell, in your time at the covering the royal beat, what do you think's the most difficult thing? Because you were kind of you've done lots of different beats before that. So you've done kind of investigations and all sorts of things. How does the role that you have now compare with the sort of journalism that you were doing beforehand?
Well, I mean, it's completely different. I mean, I spent 10, 12 years doing general news, investigations, crime and terrorism. And my predecessor at the Mirror, after I'd come back from the Mail on Sunday, was leaving, and they asked me to do this job for 6 months. And I said, absolutely no way. It was a ludicrous existence. It was all, like you said, about tiaras and tantrums. And I agreed to do it. And my first day in the job actually was Harry and Meghan's wedding, and I think since then it has just absolutely exploded. And it got to a case of half of it I couldn't walk away, and half of it I didn't want to, because it's just been absolutely non-stop. I think from an outsider's point of view beforehand, I mean, I probably had a passing interest. I may have done a couple of stories on the royal family throughout the years, but I think the showbiz world has almost died down. You sort of had a huge interest in reality television, especially from a tabloid perspective, but across the board, I'd say, in television as well. A huge interest in reality television, you know, Britain's Got Talent, X Factor, that sort of world. And then that has really died down in the last few years. So that you've got this dual world of the royals being the royals and also being celebrities as well. And we've seen that with Harry and Meghan and the way that they've been covered. I mean,
that's really interesting actually, because it is interesting because they're kind of it's that sort of they're the people stories, I suppose, in the papers that the papers can never get enough of, especially the tabloids, when you want something kind of light and bright, and that's what the royals is providing. But it's interesting you say that kind of showbiz and reality TV, those stories are sort of drying up, and there aren't either the kind of the showbiz kind of buy-ups of old either. I can't remember, you know, the last time somebody did a big interview in that respect with a paper and broke some personal news, I suppose, because we're competing with Instagram and things like that. So it's interesting to see you going down a different path like that with the royals, and presumably they're very popular with your readers at the Mirror.
Well, they are. I mean, you just look at the sort of the amount of times they're on the front page, and it doesn't really. The spectrum is so broad as well. It could be, you know, Prince Philip in hospital, the Queen not turning up to an engagement, and then you've got the running scandal of Meghan and her family, which has just been extraordinary.
We've seen it again in the papers today, haven't we? With
well, exactly. I mean, you know,
having a suspected stroke.
Of that. And what that means then for Harry and Meghan coming to the Jubilee, what that means in terms of their appearances at any events. I mean, it's a story that will keep running and running. I mean, I would just say it's utterly relentless, and I think that the thirst is not only from the newspapers, it's from the public as well, because it's not just us putting it in the paper. If we're putting things online, and we are predominantly, I would say, you know, heading towards a digital first, if not already there. The organisation, the numbers that are covered from these stories, especially the tour, something like the Cambridge's tour, they're stratospheric, and I don't think people will have predicted that even, you know, 3 or 4 years ago. It's been an enjoyable ride over the last sort of 4 years, I would say.
And what do you think the attraction? What is the appeal in reading about them, or reading about how Tom Cruise led Duchess of Cambridge up the steps at premiere?
I think, you know, it's the interest in you know, family relationships. There's a lot of parallels. People will invite people that they don't like from their own family to Christmas dinner, and then you had that exactly happening with the Queen. You know, whether Prince Andrew would be sharing a turkey feast over the dinner table with the rest of the family who didn't want him there, and that's a huge talking point. And it's being, I mean, just look at what has happened over just this year. I mean, the Queen's son has been involved in a sex assault case that has, I mean, run on for like the last 5 years, but the last few months have been absolutely extraordinary. And people just find it absolutely fascinating that they wouldn't have expected that to happen in an organisation which is so carefully managed from the outside. Well, I think that once you scratch the surface, they're just like us in certain terms.
Well, that's the interesting parallel, isn't it? I suppose that on the one hand they have extraordinary privilege, but there is something fascinating about you talk about it being an organisation. Of course it is, but it's also a family with the usual family dynamics that none of us, no matter how much privilege or wealth you might happen to have, can get away from. Truly,
well, they don't call it the firm for nothing. I think again that's the parallels that people will look at, that they are an organisation that has been so far from reach, and yet they're in our daily lives because of the way that they've handled social media these days as well.
And Elsa, do you think that sometimes journalists forget that we're dealing with a family here, and the kind of the humanity that the empathy that perhaps ought to be accorded to them?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I've had, I won't say who it is, but a female member of the royal family come into my office in absolute tears because something has been written about her which is blatantly untrue in one of the tabloids. And she said, look, you know, my family are reading this, my friends are reading this, and there's nothing I can do about it. And it's quite heartbreaking. You know, my heart goes out when those stories appear. Yeah, and especially when there are stories that haven't been bothered to be checked with us either. So it's, you know, it has a massive detrimental effect on people's lives, and it makes them very cautious to do anything with the media then.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do wonder if things have changed, Roya, because we've got, you mentioned, Elsa, that the people had printed these stories that hadn't even bothered to check, and I can't think of anybody who wouldn't at least go to or any paper who wouldn't want to go to the palace at least to say we've got this great story, and even if it's a kind of no comment or we can't guide on that, it seems extraordinary now that people would run something without checking. What do you think, Roya? Do you think that the royal reporters are pretty well behaved from that respect? Or I shouldn't say well behaved, I suppose professional.
That's a very good clarification. I mean, all of my colleagues, you know, for the national papers on very, very big stories do, you know, go to the households to check things. The one sort of that stands out in my mind, which I know Camilla Tominey has said very, very often, that when she broke the story of Harry dating Meghan, I don't think she ran it by Kensington Palace because she was so sure of the fact, and her fear was that they might either try to sort of prevent her running it or possibly put out an announcement, a formal announcement.
Spoil the story, in other words.
Very occasionally, perhaps. I'm not sure I've ever not gone to a household with a very big story, but certainly timing is everything. And, you know, there have been times where I've thought, shall I go on a Friday night or Saturday morning? And I almost always will go on a Saturday because you know, as much as the households aren't there to spite us, you never know if they mention it to someone and then suddenly, you know, an announcement comes out or something. That's very rare, but it has happened. But I would say, you know, as far as I'm concerned and all my colleagues are concerned, you can tell because it's, you know, it's there in all our stories. You know, the households said this,
declined to comment,
or, you know, a royal source said. So, and I think that's the other interesting distinction to make as well. You know, I'm often asked by people, what does royal source mean? Well, you know, I think, you know, you'd like to hope, certainly with most of our coverage, that a royal source really does mean a royal source and is actually, you know, a person in the know telling you something. But I don't think, you know, for the nationals, I wouldn't say any of us are rogue reporters. I think we're all very professional. We all understand that this is a family. We all understand the codes of behaviour, and you can't expect, if you don't go to a household with a very big story, the next time you want to check something, don't expect it, them to be picking up the phone. It works both ways. So I would say, from my experience, most people I've worked with, most people have always been incredibly professional.
And what's the of everything that's happened recently, would you say that there's one kind of biggest, I want to say storyline, but it's, this isn't a soap opera. Sometimes it feels a bit like it's treated like one. What's been the most important story, do you think, in terms of what it tells us about the royal family and the future of the monarchy in recent years? Has it been Megxit? Has it been Duke of York being having his official roles taken away? Is there one that you can point to and where you thought this is a huge kind of moment for the monarchy?
I would say in the last few years, certainly Harry and Meghan's departure has been enormous, because it threw up so many things that changed people's perception of the way things were going to be going forwards, including the Queen and members of the royal family. And that opened up a whole new era and a whole new sort of direction of travel going forwards. And I think we've all endlessly written about that, because it's had repercussions for so many people: the Queen, the Prince of Wales, Duke of Cambridge, their families, Harry and Meghan and their family. I think that has been probably the story with the most impact in the last few years. I think as well, the other thing that has been fascinating to watch and report on for the last few years, because if we're honest, it's been happening for the last few years, is the transition between the Queen and the Prince of Wales. And I wrote about that recently, and it is fascinating. It is fascinating to see how that's being shaped, how we're seeing that play out. And it's not just about not appearing at the state opening of Parliament or trooping the colour or something else. This is something that the Queen and the Prince of Wales, and actually all the households, have been thinking about for a long time. And I think it's interesting to see how it's playing out, particularly with how the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Cambridge, with one eye on their futures, what input they're having and how that's going. So I would say those two things have been the biggest, most interesting, meaty stories in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. We've certainly seen a good week, haven't we, with the Queen seeming to be up and about and on her buggy at
Her buggy. Queen reveal.
The Queen reveal. Yeah, it's wonderful. I think it's interesting as we approach the Jubilee as well. I'm sure that with the palace, there's these kind of, and I'm sure Elsa's better informed than any of us on this, is that the wheels seem to turn very slowly but surely. And all these things are being put in place for the fact that, at some point, as the Queen said in February, when she said that it was her sincere wish that Camilla would be named as Queen Consort in the fullness of time, that was such a sort of clear sort of marker for the future. But as things sort of turn slowly, we've got this kind of landmark moment, haven't we, now with the Jubilee, where we can sort of take stock. Russell, how important do you think the celebrations for the Jubilee will be in kind of bringing back some of the sparkle for the royal family? Obviously, we've had the Megxit, we've had Andrew, we've had all sorts of things going on, but how important would you say this next couple of weeks will be?
Well, it's absolutely imperative. I mean, if you look back to Harry and Meghan's wedding, the feel-good factor. I mean, that's what I always battle against, because people say, the press never gave Harry and Meghan a fair shake of it. They were out for them from the beginning, which was, patently untrue, because you look at the coverage, it was absolutely phenomenal. Everyone was behind the couple. There was thousands and thousands of people upon the streets. It was a real good buzz about it. I think the Jubilee weekend will have that. People have been, they just look at how good the Queen is looking recently, and that's people watching the Windsor Hall show, whether it was there or on TV, and then seeing her at Chelsea, are buoyed by the fact that she looks so great and that she's actually hopefully going to be able to make it. There's been an awful lot of tawdry business within the family. I mean, the way that the Sussexes were handled, you could talk all year about it. And then the public revulsion over the Duke of York and his scandal with Virginia Giuffre. I mean, people were saying that this could be the beginning of the end, because people saw them closing ranks. not necessarily, I mean, it was right up until he was told that he was going to face trial that they took away his titles and sort of banished him from royal life. I mean, it's arguable that should have happened an awful long period before, but super interesting. People need something to be smile about, don't they? I mean, we've been locked up for 2 years. People are just coming out back to work and through the pandemic. So I do think it will go rather well, depending on what the Sussexes do as well, because
well, that's right, because we've been told that they're coming over.
to overshadow it, unfortunately, and that is still a very real prospect. So we'll wait and see what happens.
Well, it's Lilibet's first birthday coming up, so there'll be kind of double cause for celebration. Although, obviously, the Queen will take precedent. One hopes, with 70 years on the throne.
If those pictures come out and they're suddenly all over social media or their website over the Platinum Jubilee weekend, then it's going to be quite contentious, I think. But it'll be fun. It'll be fun to cover it.
Well, with the Jubilee year, Russell, as well, we've had so much travel from members of the royal family. And obviously there was that period with COVID where no one was going anywhere. And now we've had all sorts of tours and trips that have been planned. And you've been on some of those this year. Tell me about the Caribbean tour with the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, because it's always seemed that they've had, no matter what they do, and it's largely kind of faultless and never putting a foot wrong, they've always had pretty good press. But on that tour, it was slightly different, wasn't it? Particularly with some of the accusations in the BBC and elsewhere of some people saying that some of the tone of it was tone deaf, with slightly sort of colonial overtones. What you were there on the ground? What did you make of it?
Well, I agree with those sentiments because I wrote them, and I think that there's again an awful lot of excitement for the tour. No, they hadn't travelled for 2 years. A big laced in with the Jubilee, some really glamorous locations: Belize, Jamaica, the Bahamas. There was it didn't really get off to a good start. There was a story front page of the Daily Mail before we'd even taken off about an Indigenous group were not particularly happy that they were landing their helicopter on their school field, and they were basically just told to go away and stop making some noise. The problem started for the Cambridges then, because rather than potentially go and face it and turn up to that particular area, they scrapped that engagement, and I think that was quite a disastrous decision, because the issue for the Royals, especially at the moment, is that there is an awful lot of feeling of deference when they're going to these certain places. I mean, we were in Barbados with the Prince of Wales last November for the ceremony of it becoming a republic, and certainly Jamaica had been making an awful lot of noise in that arena, and it just seemed that the Cambridges were just not switched on. I mean, their team weren't switched on.
Or was it? I was going to say, was it them? Do you think, or was it their team? Or
well, I think both. I mean, listen, the buck stops with them, and the fact that their team are not experienced. They were more interested in sort of the logistics of planning certain things rather than how things would look. I think they didn't get a fair shake at certain points, and the two major issues of that tour were they were photographed going up to a wire fence where there were black children putting their hands out.
That was the one in Trenchtown, yeah.
In Trenchtown, and then 2 minutes afterwards they were in amongst the crowds, and the crowds, who was probably about 800 people there, were absolutely loving them. But my main issue, again, which I wrote about extensively, that I found personally offensive, and I think there was quite a big split in the way it was covered and the way that the correspondents felt on the ground as well, is when they decided to get in an open top Land Rover in tropical dress, looking like something out of The Crown. And when I saw that happening, I couldn't believe my eyes that, one, they would have been advised to do that, and two, in the world that we live in now, that they thought that would be a good idea. And even then, when I then raised it, and again, some of my colleagues did on the ground, the team just did not get it. I mean, we are living in a very, very different world post-COVID, post-Black Lives Matter. And there's an awful lot of organizations across the world that are being made to look at themselves and how they present themselves. And the royal family as an organization should be no different. And the fact that they weren't alive to that, I thought that was absolutely disastrous on their part. And I do think it will shape how tours are managed in the future. And I mean,
yeah, I was going to say, do you think this will well, there was that statement at the end of the tour from the Duke of Cambridge. I think it was interesting. They'd obviously taken on board a lot of the things they'd heard. They'd had that awkward meeting with the Jamaican Prime Minister. And then it did seem at the end of the tour that a sort of statement came out about the future of the Commonwealth. And so I was going to say, do you think that will change how royal tours are kind of dealt with in future, or perhaps how the PR is?
Yeah, well, I do. I think they've got to look at, and I know that they are doing this. I mean, they had 2 new candidates to come in to be their head of communications, and they've since got rid of them, and they've gone back to the drawing board. So it definitely has affected them. I don't think that the Prince of Wales was had his mind changed, but from that instance. But when you look at where we've just come from, Canada, that is doing an awful lot of soul searching at the moment. There's been a huge scandal involving Indigenous children going to residential schools, abused and murdered, thousands of them. Prince of Wales did his homework before he went. We found out when we were on the trip that he'd spoken over several weeks to Indigenous leaders that he's known for 30 or 40 years. And then, we got off the plane and it was the first thing he spoke about on tour. And how on earth the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge didn't get in front of what was happening and say, listen, we're alive to what is happening on the ground here. We hear you. We want to work with you. Because they're not going to be able to convince some of these realms to not become republics. That's not going to happen. It's one-way traffic at the moment. So it's about getting ahead of it. It's about trying to keep up
and
with
maintaining the relationship in some other.
And of course, and there is relationships to be had in these Commonwealth countries and these realms. But the fact that they were just always playing catch up was a disaster. And I thought they were a bit more savvy than that, and I was quite surprised about how much they were left wanting on that tour. But yes, I do.
It's interesting you talking about how you wrote up the Cambridge's tour in the Caribbean, because we're often hearing that there's an invisible contract, that some of the royal correspondence, if you're traveling on their plane, there's some sort of tit for tat, that you'll get information in exchange for good press or good coverage. Well, I suppose your point is that you were right there with them, but very, very much, free to write as you saw fit. Well,
I'm sure they didn't like
fear
it,
or favour, I guess.
Listen, I've got, that's all what we do. Potentially some more than others in certain junctures, but I think that we had to present what I felt. I mean, that's what I'm paid to be, not either royal editor, but to write columns and opinions, and that's I felt that was what our readers should know, and yeah, we did reflect it, the feeling on the ground, but we led the conversation as well. I think not just us, but other people who were there.
And one of the interesting things that I'll probably come to you with this, Elsa, is that on that tour, what was really, really stark in a way that I hadn't seen before was the Cambridges in the Caribbean, and that moment in Trench Town when social media, the picture dropped and the social media just took off, and there were royal correspondents on the ground seeing what was happening. But social media was a different lens through which the public were viewing that tour. So do you think that's now a new challenge? I mean, social media isn't new, of course, but the power of it, do you think that's a different challenge that the palace is kind of having to contend with now?
Yeah, totally. I'd just like to say one thing to address Russell's point on a tour. It's not just down to the royal household to plan any overseas tour. It's multifaceted people. So it will be the government on the ground, it'll be the Foreign Office, it'll be the Consul General, the High Commission. So it's not just the royal household who plan a tour. So
lots of different parts. So it's not just them that's to blame.
On that point, that's a fair point from Elsa, because the excuses, I suppose, that were given from the household was that it was the Jamaican government's desire and wish for them to go in the Land Rover that the Queen had used in 1963. Whereas, I thought that was passing the buck, and I thought that there should have been a bit more organisation and a bit more savviness, I suppose, in that, and how it would be viewed across the world. But sorry,
a cynic might say it's coming from advice from a government which wishes that perhaps they should
Well,
move
I mean, yeah,
on
that's
from the
great.
royal family, which is what the
Absolutely.
Jamaican Prime Minister said.
Mm.
But that would be a very cynical take on it, which I'm sure nobody would have. Sorry, Elsa. Social media. Is it an absolute minefield, do you think, for
It is.
in terms of PR nowadays? Not just the
Yeah.
palace, but generally.
I think so. I mean, I remember the Queen remarking, she went and did a hospital visit, and where, 20 years ago, she'd be shaking people's hands, all she sees now is a bank of iPhones, and taking photographs of her. So that landscape, it just sort of really basically has changed for her. But yeah, you've got to be really, really savvy. You've got to react really quickly, or also have the courage not to react. And I've often had a principal saying, you've got to rebut this. Someone's put this out on Twitter and you've got to go and rebut it. I said, this person has got 3 people following them. If we put something out, you're creating a story of your own making. So sometimes you've got to be brave enough not to do something.
The dignified silence is always a good card to play.
Or get someone else to rebut it for you.
Well, Roya, you straddle both worlds because you've got great kind of Twitter following, and you do your Instagram and everything. I sound like a right granny now, aren't I? How do you see it? Because there's so many points to this. Is social media changing the way the royal family is reported, and in doing so, is it changing the way that people see the royal family? Do you think is it making them more accessible? Or
Very interesting question. I mean, I don't think I'm sort of that big on social media in terms of my Twitter account is largely for work. My Instagram account is actually private, and most of my colleagues' Instagram accounts are public, and they do put work on there. That's just a distinction I've sort of made. I'm not quite there yet in my head with it. But I think social media, yeah, it has massively changed the landscape since I've been doing the job. When I started, I remember actually doing a story that the Queen was launching the Royal Facebook account. I think that must have been very early, like maybe 2010, 2011, one of the first stories I did on the beat, actually. When I just started, social media was not a massive tool for the household. It now is huge. The messaging that they want to put out there, the images they want to put out there, the news that they want to break tends to go on social media, as well as to us sort of at the same time. Yes, I think to answer your question, does it change the way the public view them? I think it probably helps shape how the public view them. I think it's a clever tool that helps, allows the public to feel that they have quite good access because they're, seeing what they're doing in their day-to-day lives. And particularly with things like, photographs of the Cambridge's children when they put those photographs out, at birthdays and big milestones that Kate takes. It's clever because it lets the public think they're getting quite a lot when actually they're not getting loads. In terms of, does it shape what people think of the royal family? I'm not sure it does. I would argue probably, and I know this was something you wanted to touch on, that actually the newspapers still have quite a lot of sway in that respect in terms of.
Yeah, I did wonder whether are people being led by what they see on social media, or are the papers still influencing the way the public, think?
I think they do actually. I'm always amazed when I meet new people and they ask me what I do. I'm always amazed by the intense fascination with the royal family from a very unexpected quarters. When people ask me what I do and I tell them, they then want to just fire 10 questions at me. What's so-and-so like? What's really happening here? But also people will quote, every time I'm in a cab, a cabbie will, quote a story at me. I read this the other day about, I was on my way back from the Duke of Edinburgh's memorial service, and I had a very lively cabbie who literally probably mentioned 5 or 6 stories that had run across broadsheets and tabloids in the last few weeks. And he'd read up on everything. And 100% those stories were shaping what he thought of the royal family. They were shaping his opinion. They were forming his opinion. And actually all the stories that he mentioned were accurate. So, people love to sort of, I think a lot of people outside the media love to sort of throw it into, our newspapers are dying. They don't mean anything, you're pointless. But it's interesting. I would say, trusted journalism, quality journalism still has a sway on what people think of that institution.
Absolutely. I've got tons of questions coming in, so I'm just going to have a little just ask a couple more of my own because I'm allowed to, and then I'll go to some of the questions. They're really good ones. You mentioned the Duchess of Cambridge's photographs, Roya. This is quite a smart technique, isn't it? Because she doesn't have to spend a day getting a photographer from outside in. And do you think that's a sort of slight kind of way of controlling that they're not letting anyone that close to their families? It's very, is it just a smart technique that she can control that image? And
it is very smart. It is a huge way to control the image. The only thing I would say is I was actually having a conversation about this a few months ago with my picture editor, who said it's a real shame that when William and Harry were growing up, there were 2 or 3 very well thought of royal photographers at the time who had extraordinary access to document their lives, and took a lot of photographs and some cameramen footage of the young princes, not just at those photo calls but beyond, actually. And he had brought out this sort of incredible archive of these photographs, none of which I'd ever seen. And he said what's a real shame is that none of this exists for the future king, Prince George, or his siblings, or some of the other small royals. We will never have that. And it may well be there's tons of it in the personal archives, but we're unlikely to ever see that. So yes, it's a very smart technique. I think, like I said before, I think it makes people think they're getting quite a lot of access when it's just a few photos here and there. But I think potentially, if you're talking about future monarchs, are we losing some sort of historical archive that has always existed for important principal members of the royal family? I think it's both.
well, there's a great comment on the chat from Laura Whitcomb saying, it's my absolute #1 guilty pleasure. I think she's talking about reading about the royal family. I love every detail that gets reported, and you're right, Laura, it's often from the most unlikely quarters. Now, this is an interesting one for you, Roya. Do royal journalists at the Times work together on stories? So would you work with Valentine Low on a story, for example?
The only time I can remember working with Val on a story, actually twice, once we worked together, once we just, was a few years ago. Some contacts that I knew were having a charity fundraising carol service where both William and Harry were going to do the joint address. And it was happening, I think, on a day in the middle of the week, so it wasn't going to hold for the Sunday, but I was going, and I knew all about it, and I know the family very well. And I said to them, and I said to Val, would you be interested in coverage in the paper, and I could work with Valentine on it? And so we did, and it ran with the joint byline. Sometimes Val will ring me up and say, what do you think about this? And I'll give him my opinion. He may listen to me, he may not. He's a friend and a close colleague. The other time I can remember us talking sort of quite closely, not in terms of our coverage, which was very much sort of separate in terms of our own views, but I remember when we both discovered, with mixed views, that the Times and Sunday Times had the serialization to the book Finding Freedom. And so he and I both had heavily embargoed PDF copies of it. And so, we were under very strict NDAs, other than obviously to discuss it between ourselves. And I can remember reading that book, and we rang each other quite frequently throughout reading that book. Let's just put it that way. But in terms of, do we work together?
You plough your own furrow, don't you? I mean, I think that's,
we are
that's
still,
interesting, because I think without that, then how would anyone get a scoop? I mean, that's very much how I
We are
work.
close colleagues, but we are also rivals, as I think we all are. Val, for as long as we are editorially separate, which we still are, we don't tell each other what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a devil's advocate question, which I'm going to say to you, Elsa, and
You can go off people, Kate.
devil's advocate. Why? This is from Julia Gregory. Why should we care about the royal family? What's the sell?
It's unique. It is like the Queen, as well as the Pope, is the most recognized person in the world. the things they do, which is good for this country, is phenomenal, value for money, relevant. They will raise awareness to a cause that probably doesn't get much awareness raised on it. And we will be a lesser country without them, in my view.
Very succinctly put. It's almost as if you said that before. And what do you think the future holds, Russell, for the royal family? Will the monarchy endure to the next generations? I'm being asked, and perhaps can you see a kind of a Prince George in the future leading the institution in the same way, or do you think when Prince George eventually comes to the throne, we'll see a different setup?
Well, we'll have to. I mean, we'll see a different setup when Prince William comes to the throne. I mean, we're already seeing it. The transition is already happening before our eyes. I think that the PR machine has been well oiled for Prince Charles to be accepted into public consciousness, and I think that has happened. I mean, you look at the projects that he has ongoing. He's made a big play in the environment sphere over in recent years, and that's stood him in good stead. I think people like Camilla as well. I think she's been completely accepted. I mean, you just look at the coverage of when you said in February that the Queen announced that she would be known as Queen Consort, and just a few years ago there would have been headlines from certain publications absolutely screaming to the hilltops, and it didn't happen, and it was a very, very smooth.
But is that because the Queen said it, do you think? Do you think it was that the Queen herself said it, when she's got so much, everyone has, you hear people, you talk to people about the royal family at dinner parties and wherever, and they say, well, I've got no time for the royal family, but I've got massive respect for the Queen. And you hear that quite a lot. Do you think it was important that the Queen said that when she...
It was imperative. I do think people have warmed to Camilla, and I do think, from the period where she was a mistress, people chucking bread rolls at her in the supermarket car park has changed completely. She has huge projects like, kids literacy, domestic violence, which she's spoken on a personal level and used her own personal experiences from friends that she knows. I think that's, again, you wouldn't have necessarily had that from certain members of the family, senior members of the family, speaking on such a personal level about such a topic as that.
Yeah, it's a gritty topic, isn't it? I mean, she could have sort of gone on with sort of safer topics, but she has seemed to wrestle with some quite, some interesting topics not previously thought of as being kind of topics associated with the royal family.
Well, of course, to answer your question, I think that they've got to adapt. They've got to try. I mean, you talk of Prince Charles's slimmed down monarchy. Well, it's happened by accident, really, rather than design, because Harry and Meghan have chosen to go off in their own direction, and Prince Andrew has been banished forevermore. What will happen in the future? We'll see a lot more central focus on the projects, smaller tours. I think. I mean, we were just saying when the Queen went to Canada in the 60s, 70s, she went for 6 or 7 weeks, and we've just been for 3 days. And that I think will be part of the course. The Cambridges don't want to be away from their children for very long. You've got both Charles and Camilla in their 70s. So the aspect of how they're being viewed, I mean, there's a world of social media, isn't there? So they don't necessarily have to get out and about as much. But I think we're seeing it ever evolving. And I don't know necessarily, do we know the future, really? I wouldn't like to put a bet on it, because I think, if the last couple of years are to go by, then anything can happen in this crazy.
It does feel like so that the view towards Camilla has changed massively over the years, and particularly since the wedding in 2005. Do you think that those attitudes have changed in Australia and in Canada now towards the Duchess of Cornwall?
It's less offensive. I mean, I think you look at the coverage, which was she was considered a mistress, and then she was, and then people were apoplectic when they saw her in public, enough to sort of chase her into cars and down the road. I mean, that definitely wouldn't happen now. I mean, I do quite a bit of sort of broadcasting in Australia, and I'm always surprised about the level of interest. To be honest, there's a fever pitch about the Jubilee. They can't get enough of it, even though it's 20,000 odd miles away from their home. What will happen when Charles takes over? I think that the Queen does hold such tremendous weight in public psyche, and how will Charles handle that? I think they'll be relying on the Cambridges an awful lot to see him through for however long he's got in the job.
And can you see, Roy, can you see other people kind of coming to the fore? Perhaps the Wessexes, you know, Edward and Sophie. Do you think there'll be bigger roles for them to take on, or, you know, perhaps Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie? Do you think they'll be doing more, or what's your take on that?
I think the Wessexes, I think, will continue to do probably as much as they've always done. We're just giving them a bit more coverage, and the royal, you know, the royal households, certainly Buckingham Palace, is putting them on social media a lot more. I suspect they probably, you know, they might just pick up a couple more patronages because, you know, the Queen is patron of more than 800 organisations, and not all of those are going to be picked up by members of the royal family. Of course they won't. So I think under, you know, in the future, yes, I think the Wessexes will be important working members of the royal family and will be given, you know, we've just had them in the Caribbean. We see them going on, you know, we know that they're going on a tour for the Jubilee. They will do a lot more, because the reality is, as Russell said, there are not many senior members, working members of the royal family anymore. In terms of Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, I think that's unlikely. As it stands now, they very occasionally join other members of the royal family on official functions, sometimes at garden parties. But I think it's really unlikely that the Prince of Wales would see bringing those two into the kind of core of working royals, adding to it in the future, particularly, I'm afraid, given the issue around their father. And that's not to take away anything from his two daughters, who have their own independent lives and their own careers. I just think, given what we know in terms of Prince Andrew's determination to have them as working roles, and the clash he had with the Prince of Wales over that back in the day, the Prince of Wales going, no, I think it would be very unlikely to see them join the fold as full-blown official working roles. I'm not sure either of them would want to either, to be honest. They've got their own lives and their own families.
Who would want that
and
job?
A lot of freedom and a lot of freedom to do what they like. I'm not sure they, you know, I'm not sure they would probably welcome the restrictions that come with being a working royal.
Well, you look at some of the kind of the grueling engagements that they undertake, and it all does look like kind of easy stuff, doesn't it? You know, appearing on EastEnders and going off to Canada to do a little dance with some people you've met. But actually, when you're on the ground and you're seeing what they do, it's quite extraordinary. Elsa, do you think they don't get the credit they deserve sometimes, or what's your thought?
I think some members of the royal family are overlooked. I mean, you look at the work of the Duke of Kent, the Gloucesters, you know, time and time again, they will come out and they will represent the Queen, or they'll do their own engagements. There's never any coverage of what they're doing because they're irrelevant, probably, in your eyes. So I do think often the work they do is overlooked, yeah.
And Princess Royal, certainly, isn't she? She does.
Yeah, totally. And you think about you know, she's known as the hardest working member of the royal family, you know, tirelessly. I'm whatever, 30, 40 years younger than her, and I'm exhausted going on engagements with her. I mean, she's phenomenal. And again, she does all her research. She really, really reads up on what she's going to do. She tries to greet everybody. I mean, she's phenomenal.
So yeah, absolutely. I love that point where there was a big birthday and Zara gave an interview. There was a brilliant image that stayed in my mind from that. She said, "Mum comes back and she's still got her makeup and her hair done and her pearls on, and she just bung her wellies on and go out and feed the chickens." And that just sums her up in my mind. But so, any kind of final thoughts, I think, from any of you really on this idea that journalists are perhaps just there to, you know, to feed out what the palace wants, and
I wish.
I would say the number of calls I've had on a Saturday night from a press secretary with a raised voice,
having seen the front page, yeah,
a headline on a front page, to which I had to stop. I don't write the headlines, and then write actually the intro. I would say.
And part 2, part 3.
we are not there to feed out what the households want us to feed out. And actually, as recently as very recently, I wrote a story that, you know, the Queen was never going back to sleep at Buckingham Palace again. You know, Windsor Castle was going to be the home for life. Buckingham Palace with a view to, you know, but we know that Charles is opening up the palaces more in the future. And I got a comment, it was not a contentious story, it was just stating the obvious, I thought. I had a comment from one of the press secretaries the following week going, well, good story, we'd all much rather you hadn't written it. And I just said,
that's nice. It's a sort of fair play.
Fair play, but I remember saying to said press secretary, it's not my job to write what you want me to write, in not in a aggressive way. Just we both laughed at that, but that's the way it goes.
I think the readers might. I'm sure it wasn't like this under Elsa's and Elsa's reign, but some of the readers would die of boredom if that was all they were reading, perhaps nowadays. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you all, and I know you're all extremely busy with the Jubilee, so thank you, and enjoy the garden parties and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Pleasure. Thank you.
Bye. Till next time.